Our next session is compensation, how much is too much? Shareholders have sometimes pushed back on what they perceive to be excessive compensation. At the same time, inadequate compensation could stand in the way of better performance. How can these seemingly conflicting positions be balanced? We have with us Mr. Ajay Bahl, who's the co-founder and managing partner of AZB Partners. In addition to being a distinguished corporate attorney, he's a qualified chartered accountant. He advises companies on various aspects of corporate governance, regulatory compliance, group restructuring, and investigation. He has served as an independent expert on behalf of the Government of India at the International Court of Justice at Hague. He was chairman of CII Task Force on Judicial Reforms, member of CII Economic Growth and Investment Council, member of Company Law Committee to examine provisions of the Companies Act 2013, and a member of Committee to simplify the provisions of the Income Tax Act. He has served and currently serves as an expert member on various committees constituted by the Government of India, Mr. Ajay Bahl. Can we have him on stage? Our next panelist is Mr. Sanjeev Aga. He's had an illustrious career in the corporate world, holding leadership positions in a number of entities. He was the managing director of Idea Cellular in its breakout years and stepped down in 2011. He has also been managing director of Bloke Plast and Aditya Birla Nuvo. He is on the boards of several reputed corporates and not-for-profits and engages in advisory work. He has experience in consumer and services, entertainment and light engineering and telecommunications sector, Mr. Sanjeev Aga. Our next panelist is Mr. Sunil Mehta. He is the chairperson of IndusInd Bank and the chairperson and managing director of SPM Capital Advisors. He has over 40 years of leadership experience in banking, financial services, insurance and investments with leading global and domestic financial institutions such as Citibank, AIG, State Bank of India, Punjab National Bank and Yes Bank. At AIG, he was responsible for its businesses in India, including insurance, financial services, real estate, asset management, and investments, among others. He has served as chairperson of Punjab National Bank and Yes Bank. He has led Project Sashakt, which was constituted by Government of India to tackle stressed asset in banking sector, Mr. Sunil Mehta. And our moderator for this session is Mr. Aga. Can we have all the panelists on stage, please?
So, good morning, and I've got two outstanding persons to my left, Sunil and Ajay, already introduced to you, and I will count on them to see me through. But I thought I'll just make a few points to begin with. The topic is how much is too much compensation, and obviously it could be no one's case that the people getting too much are the working class. So I think this pertains more to the top layer, maybe the board and maybe the top management or senior management. So I think the focus of our panel will be more on the senior people. And secondly, I think we'll have to cover both the management and the independent directors, because the dynamics is a little different in both cases. I think we'll follow a very free-flowing format. I may take just a couple of minutes to give my preliminary views, and then Sunil and then Ajay, and then we will discuss amongst ourselves and then discuss with you. First let me touch on the management, and here I am not going to be too governed by the views of proxy advisors, because their perspective is a very narrow shareholder perspective. I will try and take a broader perspective, and if I trifurcate what management compensation should be or senior management compensation should be, I think there are three different approaches. One could be the market-based approach, And here, particularly as companies are very large, there can be a case for rewarding or paying or compensating the CEO very large amounts, because however large that amount, it is not going to move the needle in terms of what the profitability or cash flow of the company is going to be. So there, the moment you start looking at market-based, you've got to look at, the size of the company, and a market-based person may not think too much about what compensation the juniors are getting, the clerical people or even the working class, because that to them is not going to change the market valuation so long as you are getting by. There is also, when you are talking of market-based compensation, the question that whom do you compare a CEO compensation with? Do you compare it with people who generate wealth like ESOPs, maybe private equity people? Do you compare it with self-employed professionals who have no restriction? Some of our top-notch lawyers who can make a lot of money. So what is a benchmark? So this is one is the market-based approach. At the other extreme may be the very Marxist old approach, which is from each according to your ability and to each according to your need, and which we all know has limitations in terms of productivity and competitiveness. So I personally favor some kind of a mean, and here I go back, I think 50 years, when ITC, the cigarette company, was then called, I think, India Tobacco, or maybe even Imperial Tobacco. And at that point of time, I don't think it was publicized, but there was an internal guideline that the compensation of the chairman would not be greater than so many times the compensation of the trade unionized worker. So there was a window, I don't remember whether it was 10 times or 15 times or 20 times, but there was some kind of a self-imposed regulation. Now that, over the last 3 or 4 decades, that has changed dramatically. In many large companies, you may find it is 100 times, 200 times. So that is one consideration, that when you are setting a compensation, and if it is entirely market-based, which might justify it, how does it seem optically within the organization? And how does it seem to us as a conscience? Particularly if some people are not drawing enough compensation to live a life of basic dignity. So these considerations could come in. And so I think it's going to be very tricky, and there would be a degree of self-sacrifice, but I think just as much as the market can take may not be the best approach. But of course, here the risk is that the rival company may pay more and get a better person. So I'll ask my panelists to sort of define how they think about it. And just very briefly on independent directors, here it gets even more tricky. Now let's take a person like Ajay. If he spends, say, 15 days in a year on a particular board, he's sacrificing billing. And I don't know what his billing rates are, but I assume they'll be formidable. And so he may actually be having a sacrifice. On the other hand, a person who, like me, who's got time on his hands, would be sacrificing only my leisure or my holiday. So the benchmarks are different. Of course, there are intangible gains, like being on a good board, you benefit from having the company of very, very bright people. And if you're in more than one board, you get a 360 degrees view of the economy, of what is happening in society. So there is a lot of learning, and that goes along with some risk that in your old age, are you going to be harassed for no rhyme or reason. So there are the intangibles, there are tangibles. With these opening remarks, I haven't been able to myself arrive at what I would recommend, but I would hand over to Sunil, followed by Ajay.
Thank you. Thank you, Sanjeev. When Mr. Damodaran reached out to me to participate in this session, I didn't know why he was asking me to be sort of, I'm not a specialist in compensation, but I'm a generalist who's been, had the benefit of being on multinationals like Citibank and AIG, so have seen the compensation structures in those organizations. And then for 2 terms, I served on the boards of State Bank of India and Punjab National Bank, so I've had the benefit of looking at it from their perspective as to what public sector is all about and how they are compensated. And then, of course, the last 2 terms as chairman of Yes Bank and now IndusInd Bank, so a private sector perspective as well. Dealing with compensation in all these 3 segments, whether it's foreign, domestic private or domestic state-owned, is quite different, and there are very different factors. It's really the philosophy, the whole aspect of what people believe that they are sacrificing. And I'll sort of really make this more personal and anecdotal to sort of give you a context of how behaviors work in deciding what compensation is. And I'll start with the board compensation and then move down to the executive or the leadership compensation. And of course, that leadership compensation has a full impact on the ethos and the culture of the organization, because it's the way you treat compensation at the top. Expectations sort of move down the pyramid of people sort of wanting to be similarly compensated. As far as being in a multinational and you're sort of sitting in an office in India with Citi or AIG, you sort of pretty much get the compensation structure of an organization that's worldwide. So you sort of fit into that, and depending on what level you are in, and there's sort of, I think there are significant, well-determined norms and processes in which they compensate you, and they sort of look after you and reasonably well. They make sure that you feel that you're part of a family and you'll be taken care of as and when there is any kind of an adverse issue that you face. And they keep you well motivated, but it's in a global compensation structure. After finishing those 2 terms, I started my own company, SPM Capital, and I also got invited to the board of State Bank of India. And this is a very interesting anecdote. I was in my first engagement or conversation with the chairperson of SBI at that point of time, Arundhati Bhattacharya was talking to me, and she was keen that I join the board of State Bank of India, and we had a very nice conversation. And the last thing she said, Mr. Mehta, our board fees is only 5,000 rupees. When I went for this meeting, it did not even strike my mind to ask her that question. But she put it on the table because she wanted to sort of figure out what my expectation was. And I said, Madam, that wasn't even relevant in what I wanted to do if I get selected to be on the board of State Bank of India. So it's really a question of your own mindset from that what is it that you want to do. And of course, being on the SBI board is extremely onerous, because as a committee director, you meet 52 times a year. Every week you have to meet minimum, and then of course you have other board commitments as well. So from that point of view, as a board level, when you see the leadership of what they get compensated, so you adjust yourself and say, as a board member, I never felt that I was undercompensated, and I felt that the richness of the 3 years that I spent on the State Bank of India board, the amazing, what I learned from that board itself. And the same thing happened when I took over as PNB. Our compensations were dictated by the government, and things started changing much later. When I took over the chairman of the reconstruction of Yes Bank, now this is an interesting anecdote. There was a gazette notification, we were appointed by the Government of India. Whatever the rules were at that point of time, they were applicable. But soon after we took over, we wanted to expand the board. And I reached out to one individual who should be named, very, very successful individual in the financial services industry, had established a name for himself. And I reached out to him, and he was very well endowed. I mean, he had sort of worked in a private sector bank, so there was no question of money. We spent an hour talking to him. I wanted to invite him at a very critical stage of the reconstruction of the bank. And his response at the end of the conversation, Sunil, I appreciate you reaching out to me. Thank you so much for that. But it is not worth the risk and the reward. That set my mind thinking that is this another way of thinking about people as to how do you attract that talent where somebody we really wanted to come on the board, that is it from their perspective, and he didn't need, I thought he was sort of so well endowed, but whether it is worth the risk that he was taking and whether he was being adequately compensated. So there are two spectrums to this in terms of from a board composition point of view as to when you take that responsibility as a fiduciary responsibility, is there, are you being adequately compensated to attract the right quality of talent? And I don't blame one or the other. I mean, it's everybody has their own views of life. But we need to sort of think through this very carefully. Then we move into executive compensation. So we need to look at the board composition structure and see as to whether that is appropriate, adequate, what sort of fits into different people with different objectives or motivational tools. I was looking at a study, even for board compensation, you can see that over a period of time, the board compensation has actually moved up dramatically in the private sector. Particularly if you're in any sector like technology, healthcare, pharmaceutical, FMCG, over the last few years, through commissions or remuneration, the board remuneration, the total board remuneration has improved and has gone up significantly. Is that motivating independent directors? Are they truly exercising their fiduciary responsibility in a most effective manner if they're getting more compensated? I do still have a question mark there. I think that's really an important element that is motivating, is that extra reward that they get for that high compensation, are they exercising that independence, the work that they're supposed to be doing? I think that's something that I'm just putting a question mark for discussion. Executive compensation. Again, executive compensation at the leadership level has gone through a significant change. If you look at the last 5 to 10 years, the kind of leadership compensation that is being provided or based on market forces, we need to be a little bit circumspect in terms of how the impact of that is taking place as far as the organizations are concerned. I come from a financial services industry where it is the MD and the non-executive chairman's compensation is decided, or whole-time directors is decided, or at least reviewed by the regulator. But they are also under pressure to kind of see what the competitive forces are, and down the line there is a huge sea change that is impacting compensation. So we need to be careful about what is happening on that front. I think the important element is that in this world of competitiveness, do we have enough tools to decide as to what is the right amount to be paid? And I think it's now for the boards and the NRCs to take that call that this amount is reasonable and this amount is excessive. The boards must play a much more engaging role in determining the impact of excessive compensation. And I think I'll want that to be also an area that we can sort of speak about. Having a lawyer on the panel makes it much more difficult to see what is excessive compensation. So you can't compare ourselves with lawyers, but it's good to get his view.
Before Ajay comes in, thank you. I found your anecdotes very useful, and it set me thinking that it's so much question of where you're coming from. In the 1950s, when we had managers who set up our institutes of technology or the Bhakra-Nangal dams,
Yes.
or so many other institutions, the BHELs, they probably were paid a pittance. But the return, emotional return on investment
Absolutely.
must have been huge. Of course, now things get a little more complicated because if I sit next to you and I'm a public sector or government employee and then sometimes differences do affect you and therefore it becomes very hard. But thank you for introducing that completely different dimension. Ajay, over to you.
Thank you. First of all, I think Sanjeev is being very modest about his qualifications in terms of what he contributes. But just principally, first of all, I want to make it clear, I am on no boards other than our own family companies. I gave all my boards up 15 years ago because one of the reasons was, as a chartered accountant, the natural tendency for every board used to say, please head the audit committee. And I used to have all my friends, the auditors from my old days, who would come and make these presentations. I remember there was one branch audit presentation being done by one of the large firms. I knew the partners very well. Huge, long presentation. I kept telling them, listen, please stop. I understood what was going on. So they said, I don't mean any disrespect to audit committees. This is a long time ago. She was, the partner was a lady. She said, at least we've got one audit committee where somebody's awake after 15 minutes of our presentation starting. So you are captive to us now, you have to listen and take it through. Of course, today I think audit committees are far more vigilant. But just coming to compensation, I think principally, any compensation that you look at has to be based on what is the responsibility, what is the contribution, what is the time spent, what is the risk, and reward has to be measured accordingly. To your point, Sanjeev, as you said, let us say that today I join a board and I have X billing rate as an example. If I was to go to that company and suddenly, because I contributed something great in their transaction, suddenly say, I want to charge 5 times my rate, there will be clients who will pay for the value, but they'll say, but your time has been agreed, whatever it is, so why should we pay you 4 times the time of that value? And that's why I think that even if I was to join a board, it would be unreasonable for me to expect more than what my normal charge out rate is, increased by the risk I take. So let's say I charge X, I would say, okay, X add 0.50, and that should be a charge out rate. And therefore, time spent or time likely to be spent is important. I mean, and I've done an analysis of how many meetings, some companies have had, including audit committees, 9 meetings, 10 meetings. So that's one measure. Additionally, now coming back to the constituents which are important, I've broken it into 3. One is those who are executives, where I think other than promoter executives, the controversy around their compensation is fairly limited because there are market forces, the NRC is involved, you have headhunters, you can do a comparison. Of course, there are issues about what is the right comparison, who are you comparing with, but I think it's more easily dealt with, executive compensation and those people who are in an executive position on the board other than promoters. If you see most of the objections so far to executives being rewarded have been in the context of promoter or promoter related. I mean, in many cases, in the public, Raishar, Shobha, most of them were related where promoters were being reappointed. Then you come to within the non-executive directors, I think there's one category that we have sort of don't talk about enough, which is the non-executive, non-independent. And then you have independents. And I'm saying this because we are seeing a lot of places where committees are being formed only by independent directors, audit committees. And personally, I think in a complex business, the granularity with which you have to deal with not just what is there in the LODR, but what you have to deal with, which comes out of auditing standards and the interaction with the auditor. I mean, my friends, some of the auditors are here, and I know how onerous their obligations are. Presence of a non-executive, non-independent, like let's say an erstwhile CFO, an erstwhile CEO, is also a very important element, and therefore there is also important for purposes of compensation. And then you have the independent directors who are meant to be totally independent, and that's where it gets tricky in terms of what should you compensate. Now there is this, I think I should clear this myth, there is actually, other than on sitting fee, and we are talking about public interest entities, of course, we're not talking about privately owned companies. There is actually really no limit on the compensation. Under the Companies Act, with the approval of the shareholders, the 11% limit, the 5% limit, the 3% limit can be changed. There are many companies which have done as Fenner, Biocon, etc. So in a sense, there's no cap. But when you come to the independence, and I'm focusing a little bit on that because that is a very important element in terms of the confidence of the market and in terms of the expectation. If you see, most of the debate today is about how much should independents be paid. You talked about the same thing here. Are we getting the right people? Mr. Damodaran has had some conversations on this. Are we paying adequately to get the right people to be on the board? Now, stepping back, you heard this morning about public interest. Yesterday, we were in a session where the NAFRA chairperson was there, and he also talked about public interest, public perception, and Mr. Amarjit Singh from SEBI was also there, again talked about public interest. So you have to look at the perception as well when you look at compensation. Now, if you come to the independents, I think it's pretty clear, none of us as stakeholders, we're all stakeholders, we're all shareholders, we're all external parties. I don't think anybody thinks that an independent director is supposed to manage the company or drive the strategy for the company. That is to be left with the management team, whether the promoter, and that, they have contribution, which is an element, but they don't have a responsibility for running the business. But they have a role to play in terms of the contribution. The question is, how do you value that contribution vis-a-vis the public perception? If you pay too much, or let me step back. Now let's look at what do you mean by independence. There is no definition. I mean, we have lots of definitions of what makes you not independent, if you're this, you're that. But there is no, how do you define independence? How do you, if two people have grown up together from school, there's no definition which can say they're not independent of each other. So it's very difficult to put a pin on what is independence insofar as the definition is concerned. So one easier parameter possibly is financial independence. And I know this gets very, very controversial when I talk about in the context of directors, when I talk about the financial independence, because I know all of us like to believe we have high integrity, and we do, and no matter how much we are paid, we will be independent. But I said this in one session where Mrs. Damodaran was, we are all people sitting here of integrity. If Sunil was to be appointed by a company as a whole-time director, we would immediately say he's non-independent. Why? Because we think that his economic gains are actually coming from that one entity. Now, it would sound strange that if Sunil left that company as a whole-time director, 90% of his income comes from the director's fee that he gets from that entity, but he is suddenly classified as independent. It would seem odd to me. I don't know how you look at it, but financially, if you are so dependent on a company, you may believe you are independent, but will a stakeholder believe that you are independent? And that is where I think we have to find the right balance between how much should be paid so that financial independence can be demonstrated, which is why I came to one of the measures being time. If you measure compensation based on time, based on contribution, and even within committees, I've always said that two committees are supposed to be managed by independent directors. One is the audit committee and one is the NRC. Audit committee has a huge responsibility, and I have constantly said that audit committee chairperson, audit committee members should be paid more, much more if necessary, than other directors, because they have a greater responsibility. How much more becomes the issue? So first, I think there's this stratification, which is very easily possible. I don't think, it is happening in some cases where companies are paying more to the audit chair, of course, they're paying more to audit committee members, but maybe that can actually be extended further. Not because I think other members don't make a contribution, but the audit committee has a very, very distinct responsibility. Even though legally independent directors in the waterfall under the Companies Act are at the bottom in terms of responsibilities, first whole-time directors, but there is that catch-all clause which says that if the error is as a result of lack of diligence or knowledge, you can be responsible. That obviously, when you're approving financial statements, you're interacting with the management, you're looking at the accounts, ultimately all about true and fair, that risk of being in that residual proviso where it triggers a responsibility is certainly greater for independent. So definitely, I think making a distinction for independent directors who are on the audit committee is no issue at all. But I think we must agree that there should be a perception of financial independence. And that is the other issue that comes up. How should their compensation be measured? Now, the independent directors, like the auditors, have a sort of a collaborative responsibility to challenge management in many ways. One of them is management, we have to accept, is normally rewarded on profitability. The more profitable the company is, the more people's bonuses will be, stock option will go up, prices will go up, and so on and so forth. Obviously, management will have a tendency, I'm not talking about being dishonest or fraud, but there are always ways of looking at adjustments of transactions. Management would obviously not necessarily want to constantly surface bad news because that will depress profitability. And at least the way I've looked at it is that if the independent director's compensation is based on the very same parameters that they have to challenge, are we compromising their independence? So profit can create the pool, because you can say, okay, we have 10% profit, I have this much money to pay and I distribute it. But to link it to the profitability that in this year we made more money, so I'll pay more to the independent directors, I think will create questions in the mind of management that are we, in the stakeholders, that are we compromising their independence. Same with stock options. So it's not that I'm totally for directors to get paid more, independent directors, based on contribution, time, risk, reward. But I think somewhere or the other we've got to preserve this important element of independence. And since there is no other easy way to define what independence is, I think financial independence has to become a very important criteria. Disclosable. We had given a proposal in the Ministry of Corporate Affairs that if more than 20% of the income of an independent director is from a particular company, that should be disclosed. And maybe you get the approval of the shareholders or the majority of the minority, and then pay whatever you want. So I'll leave it at that, there are stratifications and there are justifications, but there have to be some basic, some boundaries within which you compensate, so that the stakeholder whose interest the independent is supposed to be there for, they're supposed to be a check and balance. They're not supposed to be responsible for running the company, but they are supposed to be a check and balance. Of course, they must contribute, but I'm saying even apart from that, certainly they are seen as an eyes, another extra pair of eyes, and they must be rewarded for that.
Well, thank you for introducing this concept of financial independence. It's another lens to look at the same, and also hierarchy within independent directors. But let me try and complicate it further before I start making ad hoc suggestions. The question we are asked is how much is too much? And entirely judgmentally, I do feel some of the ID compensations in some of the companies is excessive. It looks a little ugly to me. I would say, where commissions go beyond 2 crores, 1.5 crores. Of course, some of these are very big international businesses. They also have international people coming on boards of directors. But even by that reckoning, it does seem a little awkward to me. So I do think, since there is no restriction from the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, some companies should be a little sensitive. This is just, you might say it is 2 crores. The majority of companies are much lower, 1/10, 20 lakhs, 30 lakhs. But I think a handful of companies are very high.
And Sanjeev, just to make the point, just to add one thing to you, if you translate it back into number of hours they would have spent, if you look at those meetings and you calculate the number of meetings and you say 5 hui hain, 4 hui hain, multiply it by...
That is another way
of
looking
looking
at
it. You will see that the rate per meeting or the rate per hour spent is huge. It's you forget about my rate, it will be more than...
Albeit in some cases people may be traveling from abroad, so you may have to add half a day.
But that's a separate issue. They are anyway compensated for costs and reimbursed in any event.
Yeah. So that is one complication. Similarly, particularly for promoter salaries or even managerial salaries, at some point you should look, when you enter the office, you should just feel a little conscious, I think, as to if you're drawing a very, very high salary, how do people around you, unfortunately people accept it now, but I would like a little sensitivity from the side of the promoters, managing directors or CEOs, or even managerial types. But I want to bring in another complication here. Where do we require good boards most? We require it in companies which are not well governed, and we require it in companies which are not very profitable. And that is what is going to lift governance overall, not by making the better companies 5% better, but by lifting the base of the pyramid. And this question is not addressing. In fact, the problem there is that in any case ESOPs are not allowed and they should not be allowed. Commission is not allowed if you are, and the risk of going into a company like that, even if you intend to do the right thing, is you will be the guy when passing the parcel when the music stops. And that is an issue which has exercised me for quite a few years, and nothing from Corporate Affairs Ministry or from SEBI or from anyone is addressing this point. So I don't know if you have a suggestion. I don't know how that can be done. Sunil.
If I may, yeah, thank you. So I think, first of all, Sanjeev, how do you define a company which is well governed? It's a bit of a
Subjective.
it's subjective.
Well,
And
let me just put you on the spot.
Yeah.
When you said someone told you that risk reward, you might have been very right for that company. You might have added a lot of value, but you were deterred. So how do we get people like you to go on those boards?
Yeah. So I think I'll cover the first point. I'll come to the second piece as well. So if you look at groups where you have directors, independent directors in different companies of the same group. So the total compensation of that, what they're drawing from that same group as independent directors, remuneration plus sitting fees, goes to about 6, 7, 8, 10 crores. Does it make sense? Is he independent? And these are supposedly well-governed. So I think we need to sort of go into a little bit deeper and see where do you lose your independence. You have to be, and so I think that's one piece. I just want to leave that because this is empirical data that is available, that is there. You can see it in public because you have to disclose all your directors' compensation. That's one. The second piece is in terms of how do you motivate people to come in where there are challenge situations, or at least, and I'll take just, the Yes Bank was a very challenge situation. This is one, but there are many others where you need to kind of go in and then sort of try and build governance structures there. I think there are people who are driven by purely wanting to do something right and build that and spend time and do whatever is the right thing to do. Yes, they must be adequately compensated or reasonably compensated, but that's not the key driving force. And there are multiple examples of that where people have, if you look at some of the state-owned institutions where you don't get that kind of a compensation, these are listed entities. And the quality of the people that are there who are managing that in a very quiet manner, they don't have, I think it's a great example of as to what people are sort of contributing into that. So the third piece is on what you sort of spoke about is that promoter or that MD and CEO who is getting compensation which seems a significant multiple of the median of that institution. Do you really have, from a long-term perspective, the moral authority to exercise when there is a need to rationalize, because you can't constantly grow at a unidirectional. Your expenses do grow up. You've got to take some tough decisions. That's where the board needs to sort of come in and say, we need to moderate this. And I think that's where the important element sort of. The fourth piece is also, is in the board, and you spoke about different committees as to how they need to get compensated, because I think we also need to have a much more, there are typically, if you're the chair of the board committee, or some other committees, you get differently compensated. I think there needs to be a much more performance evaluation that needs to be done. Who's carrying the load of the board? And who decides that in terms of compensation itself there is a differentiation? There is some people who carry the load more and some people who probably don't, who are kind of freeloaders in that board. So there needs to be a differentiated compensation. You have a peer review which is sort of done annually. I think that should also, the NRC should look at that more seriously, not just in giving feedback, but in terms of differentiating that you've got to give, you've got to carry the load of governance in a board itself. So I think there are lots of elements in that that needs to be addressed in figuring out as to what's the fair compensation model that we sort of build. So I'll stop here, but
Moral authority had me thinking. Ajay, would you like to say something? And we've got, after that we'll throw it open to the audience.
yeah.
So I think I'll address the two questions, and then the other point that Sunil made about, different compensation. So first is, I think you've got a very valid point that loss-making companies or companies which are doing poorly and don't have adequate profits are the ones sometimes that need the best guidance. And I've heard this from many of our friends who are independent directors who've gone off those boards because they're not being able to pay the fee and also the challenges they face. They certainly need the most hand-holding, and I think something should be looked at that for that. But insofar as companies which are not governed well, that irony is, Sanjeev, which is what has created this lack of confidence in the market about independence, the whole pressure on the audit community. The companies that went under were companies which hitherto were seen as being very well managed, and some of them went overnight. So literally overnight, a company from being going concern became next year a company which was no longer a going concern, and therefore it's very difficult to judge. I mean, I made a suggestion which once it was more in jest. After Satyam, there was a group that was set up by one of our friends who's at Harvard, who does a lot of these studies and about independence. The same thing, how do you define independence, what is going on? So I said that maybe one way of doing it is that we have an association of independent directors where everybody goes into the data bank, which exists today. And out of that, the company is not allowed to select. The selection is made by the board of that body, and they pick the directors who should go to different companies. And he started kicking me under the table. No. I said, I know, you want to all choose the board that you want to. So not going to a board that you don't know the manager, which is okay. I mean, I guess from a risk point. But what I'm saying is the desire is to be on boards you're familiar with, familiarity, independence, all of that sort of goes in some ways hand to hand. But on this point of compensation, just yesterday we had this debate in this session. Take the audit committee. Now, one of the issues that very few people are aware of is that in addition to the audit committee's role under the LODR, which by the way 90% of the companies, including the best management companies have, if you look at the terms of reference, it's just what is in the LODR. I don't want to get too technical. I have a friend of mine who is an auditor, but we have a standard called SA 260, which requires the auditor to communicate with those charged with governance. And that is now being enforced by NAFRA, the National Financial Regulator, against the auditors, that you're not doing enough to have a two-way communication with people. If you look at that standard, what the auditor has to communicate with the audit committee is so granular about the business, about the risks, and they are supposed to in turn advise the auditor that these are the risk areas, these are the areas of vulnerability, that you can't possibly expect that level of knowledge to be with independents alone. They don't know that business. I mean, in 10 meetings in a year, you cannot figure out a complex business. And these are companies, some of them have got 50 different businesses. You can't possibly think that an independent director, in all fairness, no matter how competent all of us believe we are, can't understand a business in 5 meetings. So we were thinking that one way of looking at it is that the chairperson of that meeting normally has to be a person of qualification, an accountant, somebody with wide experience. And when I raised this yesterday with the SEBI, Mr. Amarjeet, he said, this ultimately, I take your point, but corporate should give this training. Now, you can keep putting it around here, but one of the thoughts we had was, why not the chair of the audit committee, who is the person who is, probably at least qualified in that area, is an accountant or he's got experience. Why doesn't he at least take over the responsibility of actually, I don't want to say train the audit committee members, other audit, but truly add some sessions for them and be paid for it. Give that person, it's no different from what you were saying in a sense, give him the ability and the responsibility that since you have greater knowledge in that particular area, because the audit committee may have many other strengths, but one of the most important things they have to look at is the financial statement, the true and fair, the issues raised by the auditor. At least that part of that business or the elements of that business which you can get more around if you're qualified in that area, let the audit committee chair itself become a sort of a trainer for the rest of the audit committee and give him or her an incremental fee and start building the strength and the capability of the committee without getting into this thing about, who has to do what. Let that person, if he or she is willing to take the challenge, let them take the challenge and get compensated for it as well.
Interesting. I'll open it up to the audience, but I'm tempted to say that, the magnificently governed companies, I'm using a very strong word, the role of the chair of the audit diminishes. But there, the role of a sparring partner to the business, to the chief executive in the top team, sparring partner, not backseat driving, improves, increases. So, there are, and you made another very good suggestion as a direction, that can somebody, whether it is Institute of Independent Directors or some other body, nominate an ID for companies so that it is not incestuous, that the same board is picking. Now this is riddled with complications because this can also be perverted, but I think in the next 5 years, 10 years, something along those lines is likely to come up.
That could.
It could.
And also,
it is
Sanjeev,
an incestuous
just
club.
to complete
It
the
is
point,
incestuous.
Yeah, there is an incestuous club, and I think we must bring it to the table that this incestuous club, which sort of it's like the top-notch rating. I mean, the recruitment, this thing of where they sort of put the same directors who go as their term ends in that group, they keep rotating from one company to the other. So I think there is a huge element of question mark on independence, and that question relates to, do they need to get so highly compensated? Because I think we need to discuss this, because this is the core of an issue, that compensation and evaluation, if they get compensated, they need to be also evaluated. There has to be different metrics. And there are different stakeholders, because when you're an independent director, there are minority shareholders, there are external stakeholders who need to be participating in this. So the stakeholders need to sort of engage and see as to where this becomes somewhat a dilemma in terms of the reappointments.
And this is not peculiar to India. I don't know if you remember, but 3 years ago, The Economist had done an article on corporate governance in the UK, and how they said that there, these 30, 40 people have hijacked corporate governance because they're the same people who are being appointed everywhere. But I do want to just, Sanjeev, because you've been in both of you in executive position, this role of the non-executive, non-independent, I think somewhere is being lost sight of. I think it's a very important role that if you have the erstwhile CEO, CFO, and at the end of the day, the audit committee is composed of many people, but the majority is independent. This new fashion of having only independents, I think, is detrimental to the quality of the audit committee. Certainly I've dealt with audit committees, I've interacted with them. I've seen that where there's, for example, a prior CFO, a CIO who's also on the audit committee, their ability to guide the audit committee about the architecture of the business obviously is far greater. And ultimately, most times in the audit committee, anyway, these people are invited. So it's not that you don't have to, if they don't know something, they'll call the CFO anyway. And if he or she is the one who's giving all the answers, ultimately the decision will be aligned with what he or she says. So having non-executive, I think this is another group which we should develop in addition to independents. Some of them become independent, some of them
Although I
are not
must tell you
independent.
that in a lot of corporates, they frown upon people casting their shadow once they've left the company, because they
So उधर से मत लो. You can today, आप एक company में थे, take a CFO of the same business from
Same
another
sector.
company, bring them here.
Okay.
But even if they're non-independent because they've done some work, let them be there. What is the problem with it?
I think we have a time limit now, so thank you so much, but we'll invite questions from the audience to the two luminaries.
Hi, sir. My name is Anurag Chauhan, and I'm from Max Life Insurance. The regulators, IRDAI, RBI, have put a limit on the compensation for directors. It's 25 lakhs. Should there be a similar limits for others also? Because otherwise there is no parity, right?
Can I answer that?
Please.
As part of the regulated, most of my life worked in a regulated fraternity. I more and more see this whole aspect of putting a cap, either it needs to be revisited periodically and sort of we need to look at it as to what's the right cap, because even if you look at the, under the Companies Act 2013, they'd fixed that 1 lakh as a sitting fee.
It's actually in the LODR, in the rules.
Yeah, whatever the rules. So I'm just saying that has not been revisited for 11 years. World has changed, inflation is there. I think we need to sort of, we need to be much more kind of open, and I would say that if in the regulated entities, whether it's insurance, banking, or SEBI related, they wanted to make sure that there is some degree of sensibilities of what should be the total because if you look at the 2008 financial crisis, the entire compensation structure of all those companies who had sort of fallen apart in the global financial crisis really became an issue. And even in the recent crisis that happened on the West Coast, there were this whole aspect of executive compensation. So the Financial Stability Board came in and sort of there was an intervention in terms of what should be the fair ceilings. But I think over a period of time, we need to kind of be reasonable and open up those limits and seize to, and allow the boards to kind of deal with it rather than sort of having those limits there. Because otherwise you cannot get, as I spoke about the director anecdote about asking him if he would join the Yes Bank reconstruction was the issue of risk reward. So you sometimes lose out on good talent because of those caps. So I think they need to be revisited.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Damodaran.
Most companies in India pay the same amount of commission to all independent directors on the board. Clearly, all of them don't perform at identical levels. So do we see a day in the not so distant future when, following a process of robust board evaluation, you decide which director is adding what kind of value and compensate accordingly? Do you think we'll get to that, or will the boards take the easy way out and compensate everyone equally, saying they're all directors, therefore the presumption is, to use lawyer speak, rebuttable presumption is that they all contribute the same amount?
So, Mr. Damodaran, I'll take a shot. You've been in the bureaucracy most of your time.
Only 12 years, as he reminds us all again and again.
And you got identical compensation to many other people operating at far lower levels. And that has got its merits. It is easy to administer. It creates fewer ruffles, ruffles fewer feathers. And particularly on a board, but you said, will that day come? I think that day will come, but it will come with many other things. Today the board is a headless chicken. If ever things fall upon a board, it does not have a structure which can pull a company out of trouble. There is no formation, there is no hierarchy, there is no allocation of roles commensurate with capabilities. So I think given this present composition of the board of independent directors, attempting too fine a distinction is a little premature, but I think all these changes will come hand in glove in the next 5-10 years is my expectation. But Ajay,
as I said, I already have a different view. So maybe not individually, but first of all, when we see every company has the same board evaluation, I have not yet to see a board evaluation where somebody is not evaluated as well as the other. At most they'll say we call out the chairman of the audit committee and so on and so forth. The terms of references are the same, but we know that some committees are more responsible. So I think there is, first of all, no reason, I've been saying that again and again, that audit committees, and it's not because of my bias as an accountant that I'm suggesting the audit committee should get paid more, but the fact is the responsibility is very, very real, and the risk is very real. So first of all, they should certainly get paid more. There is no reason why they should not get paid more. They are taking a greater risk, they have a greater responsibility, which is why I said risk, responsibility, contribution, and they probably will spend more time. That I think is happening, maybe not enough. I think it needs to be done more. Whether individually you should do it, I mean, personally, I have no reason, I don't see any reason why it shouldn't happen, but I think you'll end up probably creating some divisions within the board where people are looking at each other and sort of almost competing with, you know, who is doing more and how do you measure that. I think it becomes a little, slightly more tricky. But choosing committee-wise, I think should happen and should be put into practice earlier than later. We've also told some of these people who are auditors, who are ex-auditors, who are in the committees, that let some company actually redefine the terms of reference. We had this conversation yesterday with a very senior retired chartered accountant who's on audit committees. I said, why don't you make a start of redefining the terms of reference of the audit committee to include some of the things that are not there, which are from the auditing standards, and you know, make those people let them get paid more because they're contributing more. There's no reason why they shouldn't get paid more.
If I may, Mr. Damodaran, I'm completely in agreement that we need to have differentiated. And I'll tell you why. A regulator 2 weeks or 3 weeks back showed us the score of a survey that they had done of all the boards of that sector, and each director of that sector had to respond to that survey to the regulator, and one of the questions was asked by that each director had to fill up, would you like some directors of the board to get off the board? That means they're not performing for whatever reason. And the collective response in that survey was, I think I remember, if I remember correctly, 2 or 3 directors. I think that was the total sum of the people where they felt they need to, that they're not pulling their weight or whatever, they need to get off. Now, imagine if you're carrying that load of those 1, 2, whatever the number was, which are not pulling the load, there needs to be at least some way of communicating to them. Of course, it comes up in that peer review and all of that. But I think people need to understand that if you've got to have everybody pulling this, you've got to have some kind of a differentiation of a remuneration, particularly as it's becoming large. Now, in this case of the regulated entities, the compensation is not that big, so it's but I think the indication is that how do you communicate that message?
I think it's, but you know, you're really making it public. In the case of a company, employees you choose, you don't make it public. Here, actually, it's going to be the annual report.
No.
So I'm just saying, I don't disagree with the principle.
I know, we've
just
got
the
to find a mechanism, because see, governance is becoming, your fiduciary responsibilities are, because if you have a certain member who's responsible for a certain committee, and if that committee is not pulling.
It's better that he or she goes away from the board. My only point is,
but I think we need to have some transparency in the system, because this cannot be such a closed thing, because at the end of the day, we are working for different stakeholders.
Yes, of course.
So I would still sort of be an advocate. How it happens, whether on a graduate basis, we'll see.
Principally, nothing wrong with it. It's just a
Nilesh, you have a
sensitivity.
question?
Mr. Aga, if I heard you right, you mentioned that ESOPs, number one, not permitted for maybe independent directors, as the Companies Act bars it, and you also mentioned should not be permitted. So I just want to take your view. Of course, I'm also a strong belief that a long-term vesting of ESOPs to independent directors would be a skin in the game for the independent directors to add value to the company. So what's the, and what are the views of Ajay and Sunil ji on ESOPs for independent directors?
I'll summarize quickly. My views are, it is avoidable. I like to see the board less as an auditor. Independent directors, I see them more as value adders if they can. Otherwise, they keep out of the way. And from that point of view, I would agree that a long-term deferred 5 years, 10 years later reward, which is not amenable to short-term, has some merit. But when looking at the environment, the degrees of disclosures required, the restrictions on buying and selling, even if it was allowed, it is you're stepping into a beehive. So I would rather, not deal with that right now. And I'm not sure if ESOPs really motivate a person a little harder. I don't think there is much of a correlation. So long as the compensation is not hurting you, it is not so low that every time you go you say that what the hell am I wasting my time, you should feel reasonably good about it. I agree with Sunil that, that 1 lakh limit done 11 years ago should be made 1.5 and 2. But otherwise I would say that, let's not get into ESOPs. In fact, I personally don't own any shares in the companies where I sit on the boards. The compliance requirements are too high, the penalties are too severe.
To your point, contribution. We contribute. If I do a deal for a client, is it fair for me to say, give me stock options? I don't think so. I have a fee, I charge my fee, I should add the risk element to it and I should get it, number one. Number two, you are there in the audit committee particularly to challenge the financial statements that have been prepared by management. If your basis for compensation is similar to how management is compensated, somewhere or the other, there will be some element of doubt that, am I questioning my own contribution? And it's no different from success fee for lawyers. When, in the US, it was very common, and a lot of our clients from the US used to tell us that, why don't you take a success fee? And I remember having this conversation. I said, as a lawyer doing the deal, I have to know when to tell you not to proceed. That's my job. But if I find that 90% or 60% of my fee is going to be dependent on the deal going through, yes, I might say I have great integrity, all of that, but somewhere or the other, that thing is 60% of my fee is going to be dependent if the deal goes away. May cloud my judgment when it becomes very tricky, and I can easily take a view this way or the other. So that was my reason to say that they should be compensated well, but not aligned exactly on how management is compensated, helping you getting a little bit more out of the audit committee as the auditor, if anything else.
I agree with the same, that I think it's a uncharted waters, because you're really there's a fine line. Here the NRC is looking at what the compensation and the stock options that need to be granted to the leadership level of the institution, and to then grant those to yourself and be also a watchdog, because it's obvious that you don't want the company to do any half measure to impact the stock price. And if something gets done and then you're also sitting on that same stock, there's a moral hazard there. I think so far it's good to stay away. We are in a very complex regulatory system, and as Anand was mentioning this morning, that one little black mark on your white shirt, it's very difficult to erase. Once your credibility has gone, forget about it. I think then there is really you just can't sit there and judge others. So I think I would pass on that.
You should develop a model for a risk-weighted average compensation for time. That if my normal time charge is X, actually how much should I add to the risk that I take of being a director? And actually, frankly, audit committee, NRC, you can do a risk-weighted average compensation and say that's the kicker or the premium I should get because I'm contributing, but I'm also taking risk which I may not have taken as an advisor.
I think the only correction that we need to have on what we look at market compensation, we've never looked at the lawyers' fees. We should start looking at what lawyers charge for their time. And I think that's the only way of saying that you're actually being rightfully paid, because we're not that much less smarter than the lawyers.
I can tell you, if you compare some of the rates of the audit committees and you do the time and average that I'm telling you, 86 lakh, the Deloitte study is that 86 lakh is the average audit fee in 2024. It's not a small number. If you extrapolate it, and I did extrapolate it, let's say over 9 meetings, say 5 hours a meeting, that's 35 hours a meeting. So, 35 hours a meeting and 86 lakh doesn't give you a bad number. It'll give you something like 30,000 rupees an hour, which is not terribly bad. If you're even as an executive, you wouldn't be. So I'm saying, why don't you, Nilesh, develop a model? Is a new area of business for you.
Our time's up. If there's one absolute last question, please, the gentleman there.
Sir, one more risk area for independent director is Nowadays, we must have observed that some of the cases have been taken out by regulators which are more than 12, 15 years old. And that time the independent director is a very senior citizen, or he is not in a position to fight those cases, or he may not have the relevant papers as well. So that factor also need to be taken into account for independent directors.
What is the issue?
So the issue is about, as independent directors, there will be past cases that may come up. So you've got to be careful that, of that risk that you are
Yes,
listening.
yeah.
So, what's your name? Which regulated entity do you work for? Avinash, which regulated entity?
Sir, I'm practicing company secretary now
Okay,
after superannuating from Island FS.
okay, okay. Thank you, thank you. So, again, another anecdote. I took over as the chairman of Punjab National Bank in 2017, mid-17, and then early 18, the entire Nirav Modi fraud broke up, and of course, you can't imagine the amount of investigation, and this was carrying on for 10 years. So, I was on a flight from Bombay to Delhi to attend a board meeting, and I met many past board chairs or CMDs of state-owned institutions. And they came up to me because this was a new thing, and they came up to me and they inquired, "Kya ho raha hai?" So I had to kind of explain that we are all sort of galvanizing our resources in the board and the management to do whatever is the right thing to do. So one of them quietly took me aside and said, "Sunil, there's no upside in this for you. Feign illness and resign from being the chairman of that board." For a moment, I said, this very, very seasoned, experienced, past board chair or chair of CMD of that public sector has said that I must think. And I reached my hotel in Delhi the same evening, and I said to myself, I will not stand down, I will actually stand up and fight for what needs to be done to rectify whatever. I didn't do this. So I think somewhere, if your conscience says, I have been absolutely upright and did whatever is right, even if some past issues come up, you be rest assured that you can manage all of that. I think we have to be prepared. We can't run away from all of that. So,
That's part of the risk.
knock on wood, no one has rung the bell at the moment. So, or whatever happens.
Thank
So I
you,
think
thank you Ajay, thank you Sunil.
Thank you.
Wonderful listening to both of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all the panelists, Mr. Bahl, Mr. Aga, and Mr. Mehta, for providing us very useful insights. And may I now request Mr. Damodaran to please present a memento to each panelist. On behalf of each panelist, Excellence Enablers is proud to have sponsored education for one girl child for 1 full year through the NGO Nani Kali, a Mahindra initiative. Once again, thanks to all our panelists. And thank you, Mr. Damodaran, for doing the honors.